A bullied teen saved a drowning kitten, never realizing it was the beloved pet of the school principal. This was the story that would eventually ripple through Mapleton High, transforming lives in ways no one could have predicted. But on that rain-soaked April afternoon, it was just Ethan Reynolds, a silent figure hunched against the downpour, taking the long way home to avoid the usual tormentors. The rain hammered against his thin jacket, each drop an icy reminder of his insignificance. 16 years old, with shoulders perpetually curved inward, as if to protect what remained of his heart, Ethan had perfected the art of invisibility, a necessity when existing in the shadows meant surviving another day without fresh bruises or the sting of new humiliations. His dark hair hung in wet strands across his forehead, water trickling down the frames of his glasses, distorting a world that already felt warped and unwelcoming. Walking along the swollen creek that bordered the east side of town, Ethan kept his eyes on the ground, counting steps in his head, a quiet ritual that helped quiet the echoes of today's taunts. Freak. Loser. Why don't you just disappear? His fingers curled tighter around the strap of his backpack where Tyler Benson had grabbed it earlier, ripping it open and scattering his homework across the wet hallway floor, while others laughed. The sound came so faintly at first that Ethan almost missed it beneath the drumming rain. A high-pitched, desperate mewling that raised the hair on the back of his neck. He stopped, head tilting slightly as he scanned the rushing waters of the creek, now swollen beyond its banks from 3 days of spring storms. There, a tiny splash of movement against the churning brown current, a small head barely staying above water, paws thrashing frantically against the merciless pull of the water. Ethan's heart lurched painfully in his chest. Without thinking, he dropped his backpack and ran toward the creek's edge, his sneakers sinking into the mud. The kitten, he could see now it was a tiny calico, probably no more than a few months old, was being swept toward a culvert where the creek disappeared beneath the road. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew the creature couldn't understand. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something pierce through the protective numbness he'd wrapped around himself. Urgent, desperate concern for something other than his own survival. He half ran, half slid down the slippery embankment, the cold rain plastering his clothes to his skin. The kitten was weakening, its tiny head disappearing beneath the surface for terrifying moments before resurfacing with increasingly feeble struggles. At the water's edge, Ethan scanned frantically for options. The current was too strong to simply wade in. He'd be swept away alongside the kitten. 20 feet downstream lay a fallen branch extending partway across the water. It was his only chance. Scrambling along the muddy bank, feet slipping and hands grasping at exposed roots, Ethan reached the branch just as the kitten was approaching. He pushed out onto the slick wood, his body stretched precariously over the rushing water. The branch creaked ominously beneath his weight. "Come on," he whispered, extending his arm until his shoulders screamed in protest. "Please." The kitten's tiny body bumped against his fingertips, then started to rush past. In a final desperate lunge that nearly sent him headlong into the current, Ethan's fingers closed around wet fur. A triumphant sob escaped his throat as he clutched the tiny creature against his chest, inching backward until he collapsed onto the muddy bank, trembling with adrenaline and relief. The kitten was motionless in his hands, a pathetic bundle of soaked fur no bigger than his palm. "No, no, no," Ethan muttered, gently turning it onto its side. With shaking fingers, he carefully pressed against its rib cage, remembering something he'd seen once in a documentary about animal rescues. A tiny sputter, then water dribbled from the kitten's mouth. Its small body convulsed with a cough, then another. Ethan nearly wept as the creature's eyes, a striking amber color, fluttered open, gazing up at him with exhausted confusion. "You're okay," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You're okay now." As if understanding, the kitten gave a weak, raspy mew that seemed to reach directly into Ethan's chest and grasp something that had been frozen for too long. He carefully tucked the shivering animal inside his jacket, against the relative warmth of his t-shirt, feeling its rapid heartbeat against his skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan's own heart raced with something other than fear or anxiety. The feeling was so unfamiliar that it took him several moments to recognize it. Purpose. The apartment was empty when Ethan arrived home, as it usually was on weekdays until well after 6, when his mother returned from her second job. He was grateful for the solitude as he filled the bathroom sink with lukewarm water and gently bathed the kitten, who had regained enough strength to voice pitiable objections to the indignity. I know, Ethan murmured. But you're covered in creek muck. Work with me here. As he carefully dried the tiny creature with his softest towel, he discovered it was a female calico with unusual markings. White face with an orange patch over one eye like a pirate, tortoise-shell body, and 4 white paws that looked like little socks. Around her neck was a bedraggled pink collar that had nearly been hidden by her wet fur. A tiny silver heart-shaped tag dangled from it, but the engraving had been worn smooth, offering no clue to her owner. "Where did you come from?" Ethan asked softly, carefully inspecting her for injuries. Aside from exhaustion and being half drowned, the kitten seemed remarkably unharmed. Her fur was beginning to fluff as it dried, making her look twice her actual size. He hesitated, knowing what he should do: call animal control or take her to the shelter. But the thought of handing this small life over to strangers made something in his chest constrict painfully. The kitten looked up at him with those amber eyes and gave a tiny chirp that wasn't quite a meow. "Okay," he sighed, already knowing he was making a decision he might regret. "You can stay tonight, just tonight, then we'll figure something out." He raided the refrigerator, finding leftover chicken from 2 nights ago that his mother had meant for sandwiches. The kitten ate ravenously from a makeshift dish, then promptly curled into a tight ball in Ethan's lap and fell into an exhausted sleep. Sitting on his bed with the warm weight of the kitten against his leg, Ethan felt a strange peace settle over him. In his small, cluttered bedroom with its faded posters and secondhand furniture, he'd created a small sanctuary for something even more vulnerable than himself. The responsibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "I should name you," he whispered, careful not to wake her. "Just for tonight." He studied her unusual markings. The way her orange patch gave her a rakish, adventurous look despite her tiny size. Pirate," he decided. "You're a survivor." When his mother arrived home, bone-tired from her shift at the hospital cafeteria, followed by 4 hours at the dry cleaners, Ethan was waiting nervously in the living room, the kitten hidden in his bedroom. Karen Reynolds dropped her purse on the counter with a weary sigh, her eyes brightening slightly at the sight of her son actually waiting to greet her instead of secluded in his room. "Hey, honey, everything okay?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I found something today." "Someone, actually." He explained about the creek and the rescue, watching her face carefully for signs of the refusal he was bracing himself for. Karen's expression softened as he spoke. It had been months since she'd seen this much animation in her son's face, this spark of something other than quiet resignation. Since the bullying had started after they moved to Mapleton last year, she'd watched helplessly as Ethan had gradually folded in on himself, becoming a shadow of the bright, curious boy he'd once been. "Can I see this miracle kitten?" she asked when he finished. The relief on Ethan's face made her heart ache. He'd expected a fight, she realized, had become so accustomed to disappointment that he anticipated it at every turn. When he returned with the tiny calico cradled against his chest, Karen's resolve melted entirely. The kitten was objectively adorable, but it was the protective way Ethan held her, the gentle care in his movements, that truly swayed her. "We can't afford a pet," she said softly, reaching out to stroke the kitten's head with one finger. "The security deposit, the vet bills." "I know," Ethan said quickly. "I just thought, maybe just for tonight, until we can find her owner or take her to the shelter tomorrow." "She almost drowned, Mom. She needs a warm place tonight." Karen studied her son's face, the first real spark of life she'd seen in it for too long, and made a decision she hoped wouldn't backfire. "One night, but tomorrow we need to see if someone's looking for her." That night, for the first time in months, Ethan fell asleep, without the knot of dread that usually accompanied thoughts of the next school day. Instead, lulled by the soft rhythm of pirates purring against his neck, he drifted into dreams that weren't haunted by mocking laughter or the sensation of being cornered. Across town, in a modest craftsman house with a carefully tended garden, Catherine Winters was sitting on her front porch for the 3rd night in a row, despite the persistent rain. A small bowl of cat food and a saucer of milk sat untouched on the top step, growing soggy in the damp night air. At 53, Catherine had been the principal of Mapleton High for nearly a decade. Her students knew her as Principal Winters, fair but strict, always immaculately dressed in crisp blouses and tailored skirts, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a perfect bun. They whispered that she had eyes in the back of her head and could sense trouble brewing from 3 hallways away. What they didn't know was how empty her house felt each night, how the silence pressed in on her like a physical weight. They couldn't imagine stern Principal Winters crying into her pillow, clutching a small toy mouse in her fist. "Marigold," she called softly into the darkness, her voice catching. "Please come home." The only answer was the steady patter of rain against the porch roof and the distant rumble of thunder moving away to the east. Morning arrived with surprising brightness after days of rain. Ethan woke to find Pirate perched on his chest, staring at him with intense concentration, her tiny pink mouth opening in a silent meow when she saw he was awake. "Hey there," he murmured, reaching up to scratch behind her ears. The sensation of waking to another living creature waiting for him, depending on him, felt foreign but deeply comforting. "Guess it's your lucky day." "We're going to find your family." His mother was already gone, her shift at the hospital starting at 6, but she left a note on the kitchen counter. "Found some tuna in the pantry for your friend. Good luck today. Love you." Ethan fed Pirate, then reluctantly placed her in a small laundry basket lined with a towel. Just until after school, he promised, feeling ridiculous for the pang of separation he already felt. "Then we'll figure out where you belong." The walk to school was the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before, but today felt different. The world seemed cleaner after the rain, the air fresh with the scent of wet earth and growing things. Ethan found himself walking straighter, his customary defensive hunch less pronounced. The school loomed ahead, a brick building that usually filled him with quiet dread. Today, even that felt muted. He had a secret, something good he'd done that no one could take away from him. He'd saved a life yesterday, a small one, but a life nonetheless. The memory gave him a private core of warmth. His first class was English with Mr. Abernathy, a teacher who largely ignored the social dynamics of his classroom as long as the assigned readings were completed. Ethan slipped into his seat near the back, automatically hunching his shoulders as Tyler Benson and his friends entered, laughing about something on Tyler's phone. "Yo, Reynolds," Tyler called, his voice carrying across the room. "You're looking less pathetic than usual." Finally grow a spine? Ethan kept his eyes on his desk. But something was different today. The words still stung, but they didn't reach the core of him. Somewhere inside, the memory of a tiny heartbeat against his palm, of amber eyes gazing up at him with absolute trust, created a small space that taunts couldn't penetrate. Mr. Abernathy called the class to order before Tyler could escalate, launching into a discussion of symbolism in The Old Man and the Sea. Ethan found himself actually engaging with the material for the first time in weeks, raising his hand to make a point about endurance and the nature of victory that earned him an approving nod from the teacher. The morning passed with the usual mixture of academic monotony and social navigation, but Ethan moved through it more easily than he had in months. During lunch, he even ventured to the library and asked the librarian, Miss Chen, about books on cat care, a question that earned him a warm smile and an armful of recommendations. It was during his final period, biology with Miss Peterson, that the overhead speaker crackled to life with the assistant principal's voice. "Attention students and faculty. We have a quick announcement from Principal Winters." The class quieted more out of surprise than respect. Principal Winters rarely used the PA system, preferring to address issues in person or through official channels. "Good afternoon," came the familiar authoritative voice, though something in it sounded different, strained perhaps. "I'm asking for your help with a personal matter. My cat Marigold has been missing since Monday evening. She's a small calico with white paws and an orange patch over her right eye. She was wearing a pink collar with a heart-shaped tag. If anyone has seen her or has any information, please come to my office." "Thank you." The speaker clicked off, leaving a buzz of conversation in its wake. Most students were reacting with surprise. The idea of Principal Winters having a pet, having a personal life at all, seemed to fascinate them. But Ethan had gone completely still, his heart hammering in his chest. The description matched Pirate perfectly. The unusual markings, the pink collar, everything. The kitten he'd rescued, the one currently curled up in a laundry basket in his apartment, belonged to Principal Winters. Principal Winters, whose reputation for strictness bordered on legendary. Principal Winters, who had called him into her office just last month after he'd shown up with a black eye courtesy of Tyler Benson, and who had accepted his mumbled excuse about a door accident, with obvious disbelief but no further action. For the remaining 20 minutes of class, Ethan barely heard a word Miss Peterson said about cellular respiration. His mind raced with competing thoughts. He should return the cat, of course he should, It was the right thing to do. But the thought of approaching Principal Winter's office, of all the attention it would draw, made his palms sweat and his breath come short. When the final bell rang, Ethan moved on autopilot, gathering his books and joining the flood of students heading for the exits. Instead of turning toward the front office, he found himself walking straight out the main doors and down the steps, his pace quickening with each step. Tomorrow, he told himself, I'll figure out a way to return the kitten tomorrow, without making a scene. But as he hurried along the sidewalk, the guilt of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. Principal Winters had sounded genuinely distressed, even through the formal tone of the announcement. He tried to imagine how he would feel if something he loved went missing. But the truth was, there wasn't much in his life right now that he felt that strongly about, except perhaps for a tiny calico kitten who had survived against impossible odds. By the time Ethan reached the apartment, his resolve had firmed. He would return Marigold, not pirate, he reminded himself, but he would find a way to do it privately without drawing attention. Maybe he could leave the kitten in a box at Principal Winter's door? No, that seemed cruel after everything the little cat had been through. Perhaps he could ask his mother to help, to return her on his behalf. He was still wrestling with options when he unlocked the door and heard a plaintive meow greeting him from the laundry basket he'd left on his bed. "Hey there," he said softly, crossing to scratch the kitten behind her ears. Marigold pushed her head into his hand, purring loudly. "So I found out who you belong to. You're kind of a big deal, you know that? Your person runs my entire school." The kitten merely blinked at him, unimpressed by her owner's status in the human world. She climbed into his lap when he sat on the bed, kneading his thigh with tiny paws before settling into a contented ball. "I have to take you back," Ethan whispered, feeling a hollow ache open up inside him at the thought. In just one day, this tiny creature had given him something he'd been missing for so long. A sense of connection, of being needed. "She misses you." Marigold's only response was to purr louder, vibrating against his leg with complete trust. Ethan stared at the wall, trying to work up the courage to do what he knew was right. His gaze fell on the collection of photographs taped there. Memories from before the move to Mapleton, when he'd had friends, when his father was still alive. A particular photo caught his eye. 12-year-old Ethan grinning beside his dad, both holding fishing rods, the morning sun glinting off the lake behind them. His father's voice seemed to echo from the image. "Do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's what makes you who you are." With a deep breath, Ethan gently picked up Marigold and returned her to the laundry basket. "Come on," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's get you home." The Mapleton High campus was largely deserted by the time Ethan returned, clutching the laundry basket against his chest. A few students lingered for after-school activities, but they paid him little attention as he slipped through the main doors and made his way toward the administrative wing. With each step down the polished hallway, his anxiety mounted. What if Principal Winters blamed him for having her cat? What if she thought he'd stolen Marigold rather than rescued her? What if this entire interaction became yet another story that would circulate through the school? Another reason for Tyler and his friends to target him. He paused outside the frosted glass door that read, "Catherine Winters, Principal." Light still spilled from beneath it, indicating she was inside. Before he could lose his nerve, Ethan raised his hand and knocked. "Come in," called the familiar authoritative voice. Balancing the basket carefully, Ethan pushed the door open. Principal Winters sat behind her desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a document. She glanced up, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to surprise at the sight of him. "Ethan Reynolds, isn't it? What can I do for—" Her words cut off abruptly as a small, inquiring mew emerged from the basket in his arms. For a moment, Principal Winters seemed frozen, her normally composed features transforming with naked hope and disbelief. Then she was on her feet, moving around the desk with uncharacteristic haste. "Marigold?" she whispered, her voice nothing like the commanding tone that regularly addressed assemblies and student infractions. As if in answer, the kitten stood up in the basket, front paws reaching over the edge as she meowed more insistently. Principal Winters' hands trembled slightly as she lifted the tiny calico from the basket, cradling her against her chest with such profound relief that Ethan had to look away, feeling like he was intruding on something intensely private. "Where did you find her?" Principal Winters asked, her voice thick with emotion. Gone was the intimidating school administrator. In her place was simply a woman reunited with a beloved pet, her carefully styled hair coming loose as Marigold butted her head affectionately against her chin. In the creek off Elm Street, Ethan explained hesitantly. Yesterday, during the storm, she was being swept away by the current. I didn't know she was yours until the announcement today. Principal Winters looked up at him sharply, her eyes widening. The creek? During yesterday's flooding, she looked back at Marigold, seeming to notice for the first time how the kitten's fur was slightly matted in places, despite Ethan's attempts to clean her. You saved her from drowning? Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her intense gaze. I just happened to be there, he mumbled. Anyone would have done the same. To his astonishment, Principal Winters' eyes filled with tears. No, she said quietly. Many people would have walked by. Thank you, Ethan. Truly. She gestured to one of the chairs facing her desk. Please sit. Tell me exactly what happened. Hesitantly, Ethan sat and recounted the story, hearing the kitten's cries, the desperate scramble to reach her before the culvert, the terrifying moments when he thought she wouldn't breathe again. As he spoke, Principal Winters listened with complete attention, one hand gently stroking Marigold, who had settled contentedly in her lap. She's quite remarkable, Principal Winters said when he finished. I adopted her just 3 months ago from the shelter. She's barely 6 months old, but she's already survived more than most cats do in a lifetime. She gave Ethan a long, evaluating look, rather like some people I know. Ethan dropped his gaze, uncomfortable with what felt like praise he didn't deserve. You took care of her overnight, Principal Winters asked. That was very responsible of you. My mom helped, Ethan said quickly. She said we needed to find Marigold's owner. I hope it was okay that we kept her. We didn't know who she belonged to until today. More than okay, Principal Winters said softly. You saved her life, Ethan. There was a moment of silence, broken only by Marigold's contented purring. Then Principal Winters straightened slightly, a hint of her usual professional demeanor returning. I'd like to properly thank you. Would you be comfortable if I called your mother to discuss this? Panic flashed through Ethan. Am I in trouble? The question seemed to startle Principal Winters. Trouble? For rescuing my cat? Quite the opposite. I just thought your mother might like to know what you did. Oh, Ethan relaxed slightly. That would be okay, I guess. Principal Winters nodded, then hesitated. Ethan, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. I couldn't help but notice the incident report from last month. The black eye that you said came from walking into a door. Ethan tensed, his gaze dropping to his hands. It was an accident, he said automatically. Was it the same kind of accident that damaged your backpack yesterday? The one I saw Mr. Benson holding in the hallway? Ethan's head snapped up in surprise. She had seen that? Principal Winters' expression was gentle but knowing. I may spend most of my time in this office, but I do pay attention to what happens in my school. Why didn't you report it? The question hung in the air between them. Ethan swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. It wouldn't have helped, he finally said, the words barely audible. It just makes things worse when adults get involved. Something flashed in Principal Winters' eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or regret. I'm sorry you found that to be true, she said quietly. But I want you to know that I take these matters very seriously. What Mr. Benson and his friends have been doing is unacceptable. She glanced down at Marigold, still purring in her lap, then back at Ethan. You showed tremendous courage yesterday. Not just physical courage to save Marigold, but moral courage to bring her back today when you could have kept her or simply let her go. That kind of integrity deserves recognition and support. For the first time in their conversation, Principal Winters smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her usually stern features. I think we have an opportunity here, Ethan, to make some changes that are long overdue. Would you be willing to trust me to handle this properly? Something in her eyes, a steadiness, a certainty, made Ethan want to believe her. Slowly, he nodded. Good enough. Good, she said firmly. Then I think it's time I had a conversation with your mother. And after that, with Tyler Benson and his parents. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Marigold stood up in Principal Winters' lap, stretching languidly before hopping down and patting across the desk to bump her head against Ethan's hand. She remembers you, Principal Winters said softly. Animals know who they can trust. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan smiled, a small, hesitant curve of his lips, but genuine. She's pretty smart for such a little thing. Yes, Principal Winters agreed, watching them with thoughtful eyes. She certainly seems to know how to bring the right people together. The following weeks brought changes that Ethan could never have anticipated that rainy afternoon by the creek. The first came the very next morning, when Tyler Benson was called into Principal Winters' office during first period. He emerged an hour later, subdued and avoiding eye contact with everyone. By lunchtime, The entire school knew he had been given 2 weeks of detention and removed from the upcoming baseball tournament for pattern of intimidation and harassment. The second change arrived more gradually. Principal Winters, who had previously been a distant figure of authority glimpsed mainly during assemblies or disciplinary actions, began to be visible in the hallways between classes. She greeted students by name, including Ethan, and somehow always seemed to materialize whenever tensions rose or voices grew too loud with mockery. The third change was the most unexpected. 3 days after returning Marigold, Ethan received a note requesting that he stop by Principal Winters' office after school. Approaching with trepidation despite their previous conversation, he found her with a cardboard carrier on her desk. "Ethan," she greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to discuss something with you. Please, sit." He perched nervously on the edge of the chair, eyeing the carrier. A soft meow emerged from within. "Marigold?" he asked in confusion. Principal Winters shook her head. "Not exactly. After our conversation, I contacted the animal shelter. It seems Marigold's litter mate was still there, unadopted." She opened the carrier door, and a small orange tabby kitten poked its head out cautiously. "This is Oliver. The shelter staff tell me he's quite shy, but very affectionate once he trusts someone." Ethan stared at the kitten, then at Principal Winters, not understanding. "I spoke with your mother at length," she continued. "About you, about what happened at the creek, and about some of your difficulties here at Mapleton. She mentioned how differently you've been since finding Marigold, how it gave you a sense of purpose." She pushed the carrier gently toward him. "Oliver needs a home, Ethan, a place where he's valued and protected. Your mother has agreed, if you're interested. I've also arranged to cover the initial veterinary expenses and supplies as a thank you for saving Marigold." Stunned, Ethan reached a tentative hand toward the carrier. Oliver sniffed his fingers cautiously, then pushed his head against them in a gesture remarkably similar to Marigold's. "He's for me?" Ethan asked, his voice catching. Principal Winters nodded. "Sometimes, Ethan, the things we rescue end up rescuing us in return. I think you and Oliver might have a lot to offer each other." The kitten crawled completely out of the carrier now, investigating the desk with careful steps. When Ethan picked him up, Oliver settled into his hands with a trusting ease that made his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he managed, the words inadequate for the warmth expanding in his chest. Principal Winters smiled. "There's one more thing. I'm starting a new initiative at Mapleton, a peer mentoring program specifically focused on creating a more supportive environment for new students and those who might be struggling to find their place here. I'd like you to consider being part of the development committee. Your perspective would be invaluable." Ethan looked up from Oliver in surprise. "Me? But I'm not. I don't really." "You're exactly who we need," Principal Winters said firmly. "Someone who understands what it's like to feel invisible, but who has the courage to act when it matters most." She leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it." On the walk home, with Oliver secure in the carrier and a bag of kitten supplies hanging from his shoulder, Ethan found himself standing taller than he had in months. For the first time since moving to Mapleton, the future seemed to hold possibilities rather than just endurance. By the time autumn painted the trees around Mapleton in brilliant reds and golds, much had changed. The peer mentoring program had launched with surprising success, with Ethan reluctantly but effectively serving as one of its first mentors. His quiet empathy and genuine listening skills made him particularly effective with the new freshmen who reminded him of himself. Tyler Benson, after initial resistance, had been unexpectedly humbled by a family crisis that had revealed his own vulnerabilities. While not exactly friends, he and Ethan had reached a cautious truce, further stabilized by Tyler's genuine remorse when he learned the full story of Marigold's rescue. Most surprising to Ethan was his evolving relationship with Principal Winters, Catherine, as she occasionally asked him to call her during their weekly meetings about the mentoring program. Behind her professional exterior was a woman with a sharp wit, a passion for education, and a profound understanding of what it meant to feel alone. Bit by bit, she shared pieces of her own story, her difficult years in high school, the loss of her husband to cancer 5 years earlier, her childlessness not by choice but by circumstance. "Marigold was supposed to be my new beginning," she confided one afternoon as they reviewed feedback from the latest mentoring session. "After 2 years of rattling around that empty house by myself, I finally decided it was time to bring some life back into it. The day she went missing was the day I realized how much I'd come to depend on her company." Ethan, more comfortable now in her presence, nodded understanding. "Oliver's like that for me. Sometimes I think he knows when I've had a bad day before I even get home. Catherine smiled. Animals have that gift. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask, would you consider bringing Oliver for a play date with Marigold sometime? She could use the company during the day, and they are siblings after all. The invitation extended beyond the cats, and they both knew it. It was an opening to a deeper connection, a tentative bridge between their worlds. I'd like that, Ethan said simply. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Ethan found himself walking up the path to Principal Winter's craftsman house, Oliver secure in his carrier. The garden was meticulously maintained, with late-blooming flowers still adding splashes of color among the fallen leaves. Catherine opened the door before he could knock, dressed in jeans and a soft sweater rather than her usual professional attire. Without the formal context of school, she looked younger, more approachable. "Welcome," she said warmly. Come in." Marigold's been watching out the window all morning, as if she knew someone was coming. The inside of the house was cozy and lived in, with bookshelves lining the walls and comfortable furniture arranged to invite conversation. Sure enough, Marigold sat perched on a windowsill, her tail twitching with interest as Ethan entered with the carrier. "Should I let him out?" Ethan asked, suddenly nervous about how the reunited siblings might react to each other. Catherine nodded. "The house is cat-proofed. Let's see what happens." Ethan set the carrier down and opened the door. For a moment, Oliver remained inside, blinking cautiously at the new surroundings. Then, sensing freedom, he ventured out, his nose working overtime to process the unfamiliar scents. Marigold leapt down from the windowsill, approaching with feline dignity. The two cats circled each other, tails held high, before Marigold suddenly pounced playfully, initiating a chase that sent them racing through the living room and down the hallway. Catherine laughed, a free, delighted sound that Ethan had never heard at school. Well, that answers that question. Siblings indeed. They spent the morning watching the cats reconnect, talking easily about school, books, and the mentoring program. Catherine made hot chocolate and produced homemade cookies that surprised Ethan with their quality. "I stress bake," she admitted with a slight smile. "Most of the faculty lounge treats come from my kitchen." "They're really good," Ethan said, reaching for another. "My mom never has time to bake. She's always working." Catherine nodded, understanding. "She's doing an incredible job with you, Ethan." When we spoke, it was clear how much she cares, how hard she's trying to make everything work as a single parent. "She is," Ethan agreed quietly. "I try not to add to her stress." "That's admirable," Catherine said. "But you're allowed to need things too, to ask for help sometimes." The cats raced back into the living room, Marigold in pursuit of Oliver now, both clearly delighting in the game. They tumbled together in a playful heap on the carpet, paws and tails entangled. "Look at them," Catherine said softly. They found each other again, despite everything. Something in her tone made Ethan look up. There was a wistfulness in her expression, a gentle sadness behind her smile. "I've been thinking a lot about connections lately," she continued, her eyes still on the cats. "How fragile they can be, how easily broken or lost. But also how resilient, how they can form in the most unexpected circumstances." She glanced at Ethan, like a rainstorm in a flooding creek. Ethan nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. "Or a school principal's office," Catherine smiled. "Exactly." After a moment, she rose and crossed to a bookshelf, pulling down a photo album. "I'd like to show you something if that's all right." She returned to the couch, opening the album to reveal photographs of a younger Catherine with a tall, smiling man. "This is James, my husband. He was a science teacher at Mapleton Middle School before he got sick." Ethan leaned closer, struck by the joy radiating from the images. Catherine and James hiking, laughing at what appeared to be a school function, standing proudly in front of the house Ethan was now sitting in. "He loved teaching," Catherine said, her finger tracing the edge of one photograph. "Loved connecting with students, especially the ones who didn't quite fit in. He always said those were the ones with the most interesting minds, if only someone would take the time to notice." She turned the page to reveal a photograph of a classroom full of middle schoolers gathered around what appeared to be a science project. This was his pride and joy, the Wilderness Club. Every year, he would take students who needed it most on weekend expeditions. Camping, hiking, learning about nature, building confidence. Ethan studied the picture, noting how even in a group photo, James seemed to be genuinely engaged with the students around him, his posture open and attentive. "After he died," Catherine continued quietly, "I buried myself in work, focused on being the best principal I could be. But somewhere along the way, I think I lost sight of why I became an educator in the first place. I became more concerned with running an efficient school than with seeing the students within it. She closed the album gently. Until a drowning kitten and a brave young man reminded me, the weight of her words settled around them, significant but not uncomfortable. Marigold chose that moment to abandon her play with Oliver and leap onto the couch, butting her head against Catherine's hand as if in agreement. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, scratching behind Marigold's ears, "about reviving something like James's Wilderness Club. Not exactly the same, but perhaps an extension of the mentoring program. Opportunities for students to connect outside the school environment, to build relationships and confidence in different settings." She looked at Ethan directly. "I'd value your input on how to structure something like that. What would have helped you most when you first came to Mapleton?" The question caught him off guard. Not because it was difficult to answer, but because no adult had ever asked him so directly what he needed. "Just being seen, I guess," he said slowly, formulating his thoughts as he spoke. "Not feeling invisible. Having a place to belong, even if it's just for a little while." Catherine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's what James always said too. That belonging is the foundation of everything else." Oliver abandoned his exploration of the living room to join them, climbing into Ethan's lap with proprietary confidence. As Ethan stroked the kitten's soft fur, he felt something shifting inside him, a quiet redefinition of his place in the world. "I'd like to help," he said, "with the club or whatever it becomes." Catherine's smile was warm with approval and something that might have been pride. "I was hoping you'd say that. We can start planning next week if you're willing." As the morning stretched into afternoon, with the cats alternately playing and napping, Ethan found himself opening up more than he had with any adult since his father died. He talked about his old school, his former friends, his struggles to find his footing in Mapleton. Catherine listened with genuine interest, offering neither platitudes nor quick solutions, but real acknowledgement of his experiences. In turn, she shared more about James, about her own journey through grief, about her hopes for Mapleton High. Not as principal to student, but as one person to another, building a bridge of understanding between their different worlds. When it was finally time for Ethan to leave, Oliver secure in his carrier despite his protests at being separated from Marigold, Catherine walked him to the door. "This was lovely," she said. "Perhaps we could make it a regular occurrence? The cats clearly enjoy each other's company." "I'd like that," Ethan replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Catherine hesitated, then added, "And Ethan, thank you, not just for saving Marigold, but for helping me remember why this work matters in the first place." Walking home in the golden afternoon light, with Oliver occasionally meowing his discontent from the carrier, Ethan felt a sense of possibility unfurling within him, a feeling that had been dormant for too long. The bullying hadn't magically disappeared, the challenges of being the new kid hadn't vanished, but something fundamental had shifted. He had been seen. He had made a difference. And in the process, he had found connections he never could have anticipated on that rain-soaked afternoon by the creek. 6 months later, as spring once again brought new growth to Mapleton, a small ceremony was held on the school grounds. Students, teachers, and parents gathered to dedicate a newly constructed outdoor classroom space, a circular arrangement of stone seating beneath a grove of young maple trees with a simple plaque that read, "The James Winters Memorial Learning Grove, where every student belongs." Catherine Winters stood beside the plaque, more relaxed and approachable than many students had ever seen her. Beside her stood Ethan Reynolds, no longer the hunched, invisible figure he had once been, but a young man standing tall, with quiet confidence in his bearing. "This space," Catherine said, addressing the gathered crowd, "represents our commitment to creating a school where every student feels valued and seen, where learning happens not just within classroom walls, but through connection, to nature, to ideas, and most importantly, to each other." She glanced at Ethan with a smile. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected sources. A student who reminds an administrator of her purpose. A gesture of kindness that transforms a life. A small act of courage that ripples outward in ways we can never fully anticipate." As the ceremony concluded and people mingled in the spring sunshine, Tyler Benson approached Ethan somewhat awkwardly. "This is pretty cool," he said, gesturing to the Learning Grove. "I signed up for that weekend camping thing next month." "The one you're helping with?" Ethan nodded, still somewhat wary but no longer fearful. "Yeah, it should be good. Ms. Peterson is bringing all kinds of scientific equipment for the night hike." Tyler shuffled his feet. "Listen, Reynolds, about last year, I was a real jerk. Yeah, you were. Ethan agreed simply. Tyler actually laughed. Fair enough. Anyway, I just wanted to say, things are different now. Every dumber the better. So thanks, I guess. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan shook it. Not with immediate forgiveness, but with acknowledgement of the possibility of change. Across the grove, Catherine was deep in conversation with Ethan's mother, the two women having formed their own unexpected friendship over the preceding months. Watching them, Ethan felt a sense of completion, of disparate pieces of his life finally aligning into something coherent and hopeful. Later that evening, as he sat on Catherine's porch with Oliver purring in his lap and Marigold perched regally on the railing, Ethan reflected on the strange serendipity that had brought him to this moment. How a single impulsive action, reaching into rushing water to save a tiny life, had altered the course of his own life so profoundly. Penny, for your thoughts? Catherine asked, setting a mug of hot chocolate beside him. Ethan smiled. I was just thinking about that day at the creek. How I almost walked past. How different everything would be if I had. Catherine nodded, understanding. Life hinges on such moments, doesn't it? The choices we make when no one is watching. Or when we think no one is watching, Ethan amended. Indeed. Catherine's gaze drifted to Marigold, who was now grooming her paws with fastidious attention. You know, in all the chaos after James died, I nearly didn't adopt her. I was convinced I didn't have the emotional capacity for one more attachment, one more possible loss. She smiled at Ethan. I'm very glad I was wrong. Me too, Ethan said softly, remembering the desperate little creature fighting against the current, the sense of purpose that had flooded through him in that moment, washing away months of numbness. For all of it, as twilight deepened around them, the first stars appearing overhead, Ethan Reynolds and Catherine Winters sat in companionable silence. Two lives connected by chance, by courage, and by a small calico cat who had nearly drowned on a rainy April afternoon. Between them stretched the understanding that sometimes rescue comes in unexpected forms, and that even the smallest actions can open doorways to profound transformation. In the warm spring darkness, surrounded by the sounds of a world reawakening, they had both found what they most needed, not simply to be saved, but to be seen. Not merely to exist, but to belong.